The rain hammered against the windows of the downtown military recruitment office as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one last time before entering. At 23, she had dreamed of this moment since childhood, finally, enlisting in the army to follow in her father's footsteps. Her father, Sergeant Major Carlos Martinez, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his life when Sarah was 16. His medal case still sat in her mother's living room, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that came with service. Sarah pushed through the glass doors, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The recruitment office buzzed with activity. Young men and women filled out paperwork, spoke with recruiters, and prepared for the next chapter of their lives. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the institutional scent of government buildings, creating an atmosphere that felt both welcoming and intimidating. "Can I help you?" asked a woman behind the front desk, her voice warm but professional. "I'm here to complete my enlistment paperwork," Sarah replied, pulling out a folder containing her documents. "I have an appointment with Sergeant Williams at 2 o'clock. The receptionist checked her computer screen and nodded. "He'll be with you in just a moment. Please have a seat." Sarah chose a chair near the window and watched the steady stream of raindrops racing down the glass. Her mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. Maria Martinez had been supportive but worried, just as any mother would be when her only child decided to join the military. The same military that had taken her husband. "Sarah Martinez?" a voice called from across the room. She looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s walking toward her. Sergeant Williams had kind eyes but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. His uniform was pressed to perfection, and his handshake was firm when he introduced himself. "Follow me back to my office, and we'll get everything squared away," he said, leading her through a maze of cubicles and offices. Sergeant Williams' office was small but organized, with military awards covering one wall and family photos on his desk. Sarah noticed a picture of him with a young woman about her age, both wearing graduation caps and gowns. "That's my daughter, Jessica," he said, noticing her gaze. "Just graduated from college last month. She's thinking about following the old man into service too." He chuckled and gestured for Sarah to sit down. "Now, let's talk about your future in the army." For the next hour, they went through paperwork, discussed her chosen military occupation specialty, and talked about what to expect in basic training. Sarah had chosen military police, drawn to the idea of serving and protecting others while maintaining order and discipline within the ranks. "Your father was a good soldier," Sergeant Williams said, reviewing her family military history. "I actually served with him briefly at Fort Bragg back in 2010. He was the kind of NCO who led by example and took care of his people." "I'm sorry for your loss." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you. He always said the army was more than just a job, it was a calling to serve something bigger than yourself." "He was right about that," Williams replied. "And, from what I can see here, you've got the same dedication. Your test scores are excellent, your physical fitness is outstanding, and your references all speak highly of your character. The army needs more people like you." As they finished the paperwork, Sergeant Williams explained the timeline for her departure to basic training. She would ship out in 6 weeks to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, for military police training. The reality of what she was about to embark on began to sink in as she signed document after document. "Any final questions before we wrap up?" Williams asked, organizing the completed forms into a neat stack. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then spoke up. "What if I'm not strong enough? I mean, physically I know I can handle it, but mentally, what if I can't live up to what my father was?" Williams leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "Sarah, your father didn't become the soldier he was overnight. It took years of training, experience, and, yes, mistakes along the way. The fact that you're asking that question tells me you have the humility and self-awareness that will make you a good soldier. Don't try to be your father, try to be the best version of yourself." Those words stuck with Sarah as she left the recruitment office and walked to her car. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. She sat in her car for a few minutes, processing everything that had just happened. In 6 weeks, her civilian life would be over, and she would begin the transformation into a soldier. The drive home gave her time to think about the path she had chosen. Growing up, she had always been drawn to stories of service and sacrifice. Her father's bedtime stories weren't fairy tales, they were accounts of soldiers who stood up for what was right, who protected those who couldn't protect themselves, and who put duty before personal comfort. When she arrived home, her mother was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and an anxious expression. "How did it go, Mija?" "Everything's set," Sarah replied, hanging her keys on the hook by the door. "I ship out in 6 weeks." Maria Martinez nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears she was trying hard to hold back. "Your father would be so proud of you." Sarah hugged her mother tightly. "I know, Mom. And I promise I'll be careful." "You better be," Maria said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "You're all I have left." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah spent her days at her part-time job at a local sporting goods store, helping customers and earning the last bit of money she could before leaving for basic training. Her evenings were devoted to physical training, running, push-ups, sit-ups, and studying military knowledge that would give her an advantage once she arrived at Fort Leonard Wood. She also spent time with friends who were heading off to college or starting careers in the civilian world. There were farewell parties and long conversations about the different paths they were all taking. Some of her friends couldn't understand why she was choosing military service over college, but Sarah knew in her heart that this was her calling. 3 weeks before her departure date, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. She was working the evening shift at the sporting goods store when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, this is Sarah." "Miss Martinez?" "This is Captain Jennifer Hayes from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. I need to speak with you about an urgent matter concerning your enlistment." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Is there a problem with my paperwork?" "Not exactly. We've received some concerning information about Sergeant Williams, the recruiter who processed your enlistment. I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you come to the Federal Building downtown tomorrow morning?" Sarah agreed to the meeting, though her mind raced with possibilities. What could be wrong? Had she done something incorrectly? Was her enlistment in jeopardy? The next morning, Sarah dressed in her most professional outfit and made her way to the Federal Building. Captain Hayes met her in the lobby, a woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore her dress uniform with obvious pride, and her bearing suggested someone who had seen real action. "Thank you for coming, Miss Martinez," Captain Hayes said as they walked toward the elevators. "I know this is unusual, but we need to discuss some serious allegations that have come to light." They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence, and Captain Hayes led her to a small conference room with a table, 4 chairs, and not much else. The sterile environment made Sarah even more nervous. "Please, sit down," Captain Hayes said, closing the door behind them. "What I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation, so I need your word that you won't discuss this with anyone until we give you clearance to do so." Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Of course. We've received allegations that Sergeant Williams has been engaging in inappropriate conduct with female recruits. Specifically, that he's been using his position of authority to coerce young women into sexual situations in exchange for favorable treatment or assignments." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about her meeting with Sergeant Williams, trying to remember any signs of inappropriate behavior. He had been professional throughout their entire interaction, hadn't he? "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "He was completely professional with me. We talked about my father's service, my goals, the training I'd be doing. Nothing inappropriate happened." Captain Hayes nodded. "That's consistent with what several other recruits have told us. It appears that Williams was selective in his targets. But here's where it gets complicated, we need you to help us gather evidence." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. "What do you mean?" "We'd like you to go back to the recruitment office under the pretense of having questions about your upcoming departure. We'll wire you up, and you can try to get him to reveal information about his activities. With your help, we might be able to protect other young women from becoming victims." The request hung in the air between them like a thundercloud. Sarah's first instinct was to say no. She wasn't trained for undercover work, and the thought of deliberately deceiving someone terrified her. But then, she thought about other young women who might be vulnerable to a predator in uniform, someone who was supposed to represent the honor and integrity of the military. "What exactly would I need to do?" she asked. Captain Hayes pulled out a folder and opened it. "We'd schedule a follow-up appointment for you to discuss some concerns about your training assignment." During the conversation, you'd try to steer the discussion toward his interactions with other female recruits. See if he makes any inappropriate comments or suggestions. Sarah studied the documents Captain Hayes had laid out. They included statements from 3 other women, all describing similar patterns of behavior. Sergeant Williams had allegedly used his authority to pressure them into compromising situations, promising better assignments or easier treatment in exchange for sexual favors. "These women," Sarah said, pointing to the statements. "What happened to them? 2 of them are still planning to ship out, but they're requesting transfers to different recruiters. The 3rd has decided not to enlist at all. She says the experience has completely soured her on military service." That last statement made Sarah's decision for her. The idea that someone would abuse their position to take away another person's dream of serving their country was unacceptable. Her father had taught her that the uniform meant something. It represented a commitment to protect and serve others, not to exploit them. "I'll do it," Sarah said firmly. Captain Hayes smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I thought you might say that. Your father's reputation for integrity is well known in military circles. It's clear he passed those values on to you." They spent the next hour going over the plan in detail. Sarah would call Sergeant Williams and request an appointment to discuss some concerns about her military police assignment. The meeting would take place in 2 days, giving the investigation team time to set up surveillance equipment and position backup personnel nearby. "Remember," Captain Hayes emphasized as they prepared to leave, "your safety is our top priority. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or threatened, use the code phrase, 'I need to call my mother,' and we'll intervene immediately." Sarah drove home with her mind reeling from everything she had learned. The man she had trusted to guide her into military service might be a predator who was betraying everything the uniform stood for. It made her stomach turn to think about what he might have done to other young women who were just trying to serve their country. That evening, she sat with her mother on the back porch, watching the sunset and trying to process her emotions without revealing what was happening. Maria seemed to sense that something was troubling her daughter. "You've been quiet since you got home," Maria observed. "Is everything okay with your enlistment?" Sarah had to choose her words carefully. "Just some final details to work out. Nothing major, but I need to go back to the recruitment office in a couple of days." Her mother nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to black, and Sarah found herself thinking about her father. What would he do in this situation? She knew the answer: he would do whatever was necessary to protect others and uphold the integrity of the institution he had sworn to serve. 2 days later, Sarah walked back into the recruitment office, this time wearing a small recording device hidden in her jacket. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to appear calm and confident. The same receptionist greeted her and directed her to wait for Sergeant Williams. "Sarah," Williams called out when he saw her. "Good to see you again. Come on back." As they walked to his office, Sarah noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. The way his hand briefly touched the small of her back as he guided her through the door. How his eyes lingered on her figure when he thought she wasn't looking. Small things that could be innocent or could be signs of something more sinister. "So what's on your mind?" Williams asked, settling into his chair. "Getting cold feet about shipping out?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment with Captain Hayes. "Not exactly cold feet, but I do have some concerns about the military police training. I've been reading online that some of the instructors can be pretty harsh with female trainees." Williams leaned forward slightly. "Where did you hear that?" just some forums and discussion boards. Some women were saying that certain instructors expect extra cooperation from female soldiers to get through training successfully. The change in William's expression was subtle but noticeable. His professional demeanor seemed to shift slightly, and Sarah could see him calculating his response. "Well," he said slowly, "the military can be a challenging environment for women. It's important to understand that sometimes, building relationships with the right people can make things easier. Not everyone gets that." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. He was starting to reveal his true nature. "What kind of relationships do you mean?" William stood up and walked around his desk, moving closer to her chair. "Smart women understand that success in the military sometimes requires flexibility. Knowing how to work with people in positions of authority." He was standing behind her chair now, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, she had to fight every instinct not to jump up and run from the room. "The thing is, Sarah," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, "I could make some calls. Ensure that you get assigned to instructors who appreciate dedicated soldiers. But that kind of favor requires trust between us." His hand was still on her shoulder, and Sarah could feel his fingers beginning to move in small, circular motions. This was it, the moment when his true intentions would be revealed. She forced herself to remain still and see how far he would go. "What kind of trust?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind that shows me you're serious about your career. That you understand how things really work in the military." William's hand moved from her shoulder to her neck, his fingers tracing along her skin in a way that made her feel sick to her stomach. But before she could respond, before she could even decide whether to use her code phrase, the office door burst open. "Sergeant Williams." Sarah spun around to see 3 men in military dress uniforms standing in the doorway. The man in the center wore the stars of a general, flanked by 2 colonels. All 3 had expressions of barely controlled rage on their faces. Williams jerked his hand away from Sarah and stumbled backward, his face going pale. "General Morrison. We were just..." "We heard every word, Sergeant," General Morrison said, stepping into the room. His voice was low and dangerous, the kind of tone that suggested violence was a very real possibility. "Ms. Martinez, are you all right?" Sarah stood up on shaky legs, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "Yes, sir. I'm fine." General Morrison nodded to one of the colonels, who immediately moved to Sarah's side. "Colonel Patterson will escort you out of here. Captain Hayes is waiting downstairs to debrief you." As Sarah was led from the office, she could hear General Morrison's voice behind her, cold and filled with authority. "Sergeant Williams, you are under arrest for violation of Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, cruelty and maltreatment of subordinates. You have the right to remain silent." The voice faded as Colonel Patterson guided her toward the elevator. Sarah's legs felt like rubber, and she was grateful for the steady hand on her elbow keeping her upright. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was now leaving her system, replaced by a combination of relief and emotional exhaustion. "You did good in there," Colonel Patterson said quietly as they waited for the elevator. "That took real courage." Sarah looked up at him, a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. "How did you know to come in when you did?" Captain Hayes and her team were monitoring everything. "When Williams put his hands on you, that was enough evidence to move in. We couldn't let it go any further." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. As they descended toward the lobby, Sarah realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She had helped expose a predator, but she had also seen the military justice system work exactly as it should: swift, decisive, and protective of those who needed protection. Captain Hayes was waiting in the lobby, along with 2 other investigators. When she saw Sarah, her expression softened with concern and gratitude. "Sarah, how are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Is it over?" "The hard part is," Captain Hayes assured her. "Williams is in custody, and, with the evidence we gathered today, he'll be facing a court-martial." But, I need you to know something. What you did today will protect other young women from going through what those victims experienced. You should be proud of yourself." As Sarah walked out of the federal building and into the afternoon sunlight, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was proud that she had helped stop a predator, but she was also angry that someone in uniform had betrayed the trust placed in them. Most of all, though, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her father had always told her that the military was a calling to serve something bigger than herself. Today, she had lived up to that calling even before she had officially become a soldier. The Army needed people who would stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. 6 weeks later, Sarah Martinez shipped out to Fort Leonard Wood as scheduled, but with a new recruiter handling her final paperwork. As the bus pulled away from the depot, she looked back at her hometown one last time and thought about the journey that lay ahead. She was ready to serve, ready to protect others, and ready to uphold the honor that the uniform represented. Her father would indeed be proud. The hot Missouri sun beat down mercilessly on the parade grounds of Fort Leonard Wood as Sarah Martinez completed her 15th week of military police training. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, but her posture remained rigid and professional as Drill Sergeant Foster inspected the ranks of soon-to-be graduates. "Martinez," Foster barked, stopping directly in front of her. "Outstanding performance this morning. You've set the standard for your platoon throughout this entire cycle." Sarah kept her eyes focused straight ahead, but inside she felt a surge of pride. The months since the incident with Sergeant Williams had been transformative. The anger and determination she felt after exposing the corrupt recruiter had fueled her through the most challenging aspects of basic training and military police school. "Yes, Drill Sergeant," she responded with crisp precision. Foster moved on down the line, but Sarah could feel the respect in his voice. It hadn't been easy earning that respect. When she first arrived at Fort Leonard Wood, some of her fellow trainees had heard rumors about her involvement in Williams' arrest. A few had questioned whether she was a snitch who couldn't be trusted. It took weeks of proving herself through performance and character before those doubts faded away. After the formation was dismissed, Sarah walked to the mess hall with her battle buddy, Private Jackson, a 19-year-old from Detroit who had become one of her closest friends during training. Jackson was tough as nails despite his young age, and he had been one of the first to stand up for Sarah when questions about her integrity arose. "Can you believe we graduate tomorrow?" Jackson asked, shaking his head in amazement. "Feels like yesterday we were getting smoked for not making our bunks tight enough." Sarah smiled at the memory. The early weeks of training had been brutal, 18-hour days filled with physical training, weapons instruction, legal procedures, and tactical exercises. But, gradually, she had found her rhythm and discovered skills she never knew she possessed. "I keep thinking about what comes next," Sarah replied, opening her MRE. Fort Bragg is going to be a whole different challenge. Both Sarah and Jackson had received orders to the 503rd Military Police Battalion at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It was a prestigious assignment, especially for new soldiers, and Sarah suspected that her role in the Williams investigation had something to do with her placement. Not that she minded, Fort Bragg was where her father had served, and she was eager to walk in his footsteps. As they ate lunch, Drill Sergeant Foster approached their table. In the relaxed atmosphere of the final week, the drill sergeants had become more approachable, sharing wisdom and advice about military life beyond training. "Martinez, Jackson," Foster said, sitting down across from them. "You two have been selected for something special. Report to the company commander's office at 1,400 hours." Sarah and Jackson exchanged puzzled glances. "What's this about, Drill Sergeant?" Jackson asked. Foster smiled mysteriously. "You'll find out soon enough. Just make sure you're in your dress uniforms." 2 hours later, Sarah stood outside Captain Rodriguez's office, her mind racing with possibilities. Through the frosted glass door, she could see multiple figures moving around inside. Jackson stood beside her, looking equally nervous and curious. "Enter," came the voice from inside when Sarah knocked. They pushed through the door and immediately came to attention. Captain Rodriguez sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. 3 men in dress uniforms occupied chairs around the office, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she recognized them. General Morrison, the same general who had burst into Williams' office 6 months earlier, stood up and extended his hand.
"Private Martinez, it's good to see you again."
"General Morrison, sir," Sarah replied, accepting his handshake.
"This is unexpected." "At ease, both of you," the general said. "Please, sit down. We have something important to discuss."
The other 2 men were introduced as Colonel Stevens from the Pentagon and Major General Thompson, the commanding general of Fort Bragg.
Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to understand why such high-ranking officers were taking an interest in 2 new military police soldiers.
"Private Martinez," General Morrison began, "your actions during the Williams investigation demonstrated exactly the kind of character and integrity the Army needs in its military police corps. But, more than that, they showed a level of courage and moral clarity that impressed everyone involved in the case." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "I was just doing what was right, sir."
"Exactly," Colonel Stevens interjected.
"And that's precisely why you're here. The Army is implementing a new program designed to combat sexual harassment and assault within the ranks. We need soldiers who have proven they can stand up to corruption and abuse of power, regardless of the rank of the perpetrator."
Major General Thompson leaned forward.
"We'd like to offer you and Private Jackson positions in a special unit at Fort Bragg. You'll still be military police, but you'll be part of a team specifically tasked with investigating allegations of misconduct within the military. It's challenging work, and it won't always make you popular with other soldiers."
The room fell silent as Sarah and Jackson processed this unexpected offer.
Sarah thought about her father and the values he had instilled in her. She thought about the young women who might become victims if predators like Williams were allowed to operate unchecked.
"What exactly would our duties involve?" Sarah asked. General Morrison pulled out a thick folder.
"You'd work directly with the Criminal Investigation Division, but as uniformed military police rather than CID agents. Your job would be to investigate reports of sexual harassment, fraternization violations, and abuse of authority. Sometimes that might involve undercover work similar to what you did with Williams." Jackson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, with respect, that sounds like it could make us targets for retaliation."
"It could," Major General Thompson admitted.
"That's why we're only offering this assignment to soldiers who have already proven they can handle that pressure. Your training records and performance evaluations show that both of you have the skills and temperament for this kind of work." Sarah looked at Jackson, then back at the generals.
The opportunity was both exciting and intimidating.
On one hand, it was a chance to make a real difference in protecting other soldiers. On the other hand, it would put her in direct conflict with some of the people she was supposed to work alongside. "How long would this assignment last?" she asked. "Initially, 2 years," Colonel Stevens replied. "After that, you could return to regular military police duties or, if you've shown aptitude for investigative work, potentially transition to CID permanently." Sarah thought about the 3 women who had filed complaints against Williams. She remembered how relieved they had looked when Captain Hayes told them he had been arrested. The idea that she could help prevent other soldiers from experiencing that kind of abuse was compelling. "I accept," Sarah said without hesitation. Jackson looked surprised by her quick decision, but, after a moment, he nodded.
"If Martinez is in, so am I."
The generals exchanged satisfied glances.
"Outstanding," General Morrison said.
"You'll receive additional specialized training before you begin your duties, but, first, you need to graduate from military police school and get settled at Fort Bragg." As the meeting concluded and the high-ranking officers prepared to leave, General Morrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Private Martinez, I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "The work you're about to undertake won't always be appreciated by your fellow soldiers. Some will see you as a threat to unit cohesion. Others will question your motives. But I want you to know that you have the full support of the Army's senior leadership."
Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir. My father always told me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing."
General Morrison smiled.
your father was a wise man. And, from what I've seen, he raised a daughter who shares his integrity. The next day, Sarah graduated from military police school with honors, ranking third in her class of 84 soldiers. As she walked across the stage to receive her certificate, she caught sight of her mother in the audience. Maria Martinez had flown in from California to watch her daughter's graduation, and the pride on her face was unmistakable. After the ceremony, Sarah introduced her mother to Jackson and some of her other classmates. The celebration was bittersweet. While everyone was excited about their new assignments, they all knew they might never see each other again. The Army had a way of scattering soldiers across the globe. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," Maria said as they walked around the base later that afternoon. "Your father would be amazed to see the soldier you've become." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. "I hope so. I still feel like I'm just getting started." "That's the beauty of it," Maria replied. "You have your whole career ahead of you to make a difference." 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in front of the gates of Fort Bragg for the first time. The base was massive, home to over 50,000 soldiers and their families. As her taxi drove through the sprawling installation, Sarah marveled at the scale of the operation. This was where her father had served, where he had honed the skills that would later make him a respected NCO. Her first stop was the 503rd Military Police Battalion headquarters, where she would formally check in and receive her initial assignment. The building was a standard Army structure, functional rather than beautiful, with the kind of institutional architecture that characterized military facilities worldwide. "Private Martinez, reporting for duty," she announced to the staff duty NCO behind the front desk. The sergeant looked up from his paperwork and smiled. "We've been expecting you. Colonel Williams wants to see you immediately." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Excuse me, Sergeant? Did you say Colonel Williams?" The NCO noticed her expression and quickly clarified. "Colonel James Williams, our battalion commander. No relation to that piece of trash recruiter you helped put away. We all heard about what you did. You've got some serious respect around here before you even start." Relief flooded through Sarah's system. For a moment, she had worried that somehow the corrupt recruiter had been promoted rather than court-martialed. But this was a different Williams entirely, and, apparently, word of her actions had preceded her to Fort Bragg. Colonel Williams turned out to be a tall, distinguished-looking man in his late 40s with graying temples and intelligent eyes. His office was decorated with photos from various deployments and military awards spanning what was clearly a successful career. "Private Martinez," he said, rising from his desk to shake her hand. "Welcome to the 503rd. I've heard quite a bit about you." "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be assigned to this unit." Colonel Williams gestured for her to sit down. "Before we discuss your specific duties, I want to address something directly. I know about your involvement in the Williams investigation, and I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. The Army is better because soldiers like you are willing to stand up against corruption." Sarah felt a familiar warmth of pride. "I just did what any soldier should do, sir." "Perhaps, but not every soldier would have had the courage to actually do it," Williams replied. "Now, let's talk about why you're really here. General Morrison briefed me on the special assignment you've accepted. Your primary duties will be with our regular military police company, but you'll also be working part-time with a joint task force investigating misconduct allegations." He pulled out a file folder and opened it on his desk. "Your first case involves allegations of fraternization between an NCO and junior enlisted soldiers in an infantry unit. It's complicated because the NCO in question is well-liked and has an otherwise exemplary record." Sarah studied the basic facts of the case. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a squad leader in the 82nd Airborne Division, was accused of having inappropriate relationships with 2 female soldiers in his company. The allegations had been made anonymously, and the initial investigation had been inconclusive. "What makes this case particularly challenging," Colonel Williams continued, "is that Torres has been recommended for promotion to Sergeant First Class. If the allegations are true, it would be a devastating blow to his career. If they're false, pursuing the investigation could destroy the reputation of an outstanding soldier."
Sarah absorbed the complexity of the situation. Unlike the Williams case, where the evidence was clear-cut, this investigation would require careful detective work and sensitive handling of all parties involved. "Who will I be working with on this?" she asked. "Agent Jennifer Morrison from CID, yes, she's related to the general. She's one of the best investigators in the business. You'll also be partnered with Sergeant First Class David Chen, an experienced military police investigator." As if summoned by their conversation, Agent Morrison appeared in the doorway. Sarah recognized her immediately from the Williams investigation. She was Captain Hayes' younger sister and shared the same sharp intelligence and professional demeanor. "Ready to get to work, Private Martinez?" Agent Morrison asked with a slight smile. Sarah stood up and straightened her uniform. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." Over the next several hours, Agent Morrison briefed Sarah on the Torres case in detail. The allegations had surfaced when one of the female soldiers involved had confided in a friend, who eventually reported it through official channels. The complexity arose from the fact that both women initially denied any inappropriate relationship when questioned directly. "The thing about these cases," Agent Morrison explained as they walked through the CID offices, "is that victims often feel conflicted about coming forward. They may genuinely care about the person who's violated their trust, or they may fear retaliation if they speak up." Sarah nodded, thinking about her own experience with Williams. "How do we get them to tell the truth without making them feel like victims all over again?" Very carefully, Morrison replied. "And that's where your particular skills come in. You've been through a similar situation, so you understand the emotional complexity involved. Sometimes victims will open up to someone who's been in their shoes." They met Sergeant First Class Chen at the CID building later that afternoon. Chen was a compact man in his early 30s with the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. His handshake was firm, and his manner was all business. "Private Martinez," he said, "I've reviewed your file. Impressive work on the Williams case. Are you ready for something a bit more complicated?" "Yes, Sergeant." "What's our approach?" Chen pulled out a whiteboard and began sketching out a timeline. "We start by interviewing everyone in Torres' chain of command, as well as soldiers who work closely with him. We're looking for patterns of behavior, changes in his interactions with female soldiers, anything that might corroborate or refute the allegations." Agent Morrison added, "We also need to be very careful about how we approach the alleged victims. If they feel pressured or threatened, they'll clam up completely. But if we can establish trust, they might be willing to provide the details we need to either substantiate the allegations or clear Torres' name." Sarah studied the information they had compiled so far. Staff Sergeant Torres had been in the Army for 8 years and had an exemplary record. He was married with 2 young children and had served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan with distinction. On the surface, he seemed like an unlikely candidate for misconduct allegations. "What do we know about the accusers?" Sarah asked. "Private First Class Rebecca Johnson and Specialist Amanda Wong," Chen replied. "Both are relatively new to the unit. Johnson has been there 6 months, Wong about a year. Both are single, both have clean records. Johnson is 19, Wong is 22. Agent Morrison pulled up photos of both women on her laptop. Johnson comes from a military family. Her father is a retired sergeant major. Wong is a college graduate who enlisted after having trouble finding work in her field. Neither has any history of making false accusations or seeking attention." Sarah examined the photos and basic information about each woman. They looked young and somewhat vulnerable, exactly the type of soldiers that predators might target. But they also appeared intelligent and mature enough to understand the serious nature of making accusations against an NCO. "What's our timeline?" Sarah asked. "General Morrison wants a resolution within 30 days, Chen replied. "Either we find evidence to support the allegations and recommend action against Torres, or we determine that the allegations are unfounded and clear his name. Anything longer than that puts his promotion recommendation in limbo and potentially damages his career regardless of the truth." As the briefing concluded, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. An NCO's career and reputation hung in the balance, but so did the integrity of the military justice system and the protection of potentially vulnerable soldiers.
Getting it wrong in either direction could have serious consequences.
That evening, Sarah sat in her barracks room, surrounded by case files and legal references. Her roommate, a military police soldier named Sandra Kim, was studying for her sergeant promotion board and trying not to be distracted by Sarah's work.
Heavy reading? Kim asked, glancing at the stack of documents on Sarah's desk. Sarah looked up from a manual on interview techniques.
Just trying to understand all the regulations and procedures.
I want to make sure I do this right. Kim nodded sympathetically. Word around the unit is that you're working some pretty serious cases. That's got to be stressful.
It is, Sarah admitted.
But it's also important work. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, who will?
As she returned to her studying, Sarah thought about the conversation she had planned for the next day. Agent Morrison had arranged for her to have an informal conversation with Private First Class Johnson, ostensibly to discuss general military police procedures and career opportunities. The real purpose was to establish rapport and see if Johnson might be willing to share information about her interactions with Staff Sergeant Torres. Sarah knew that the success or failure of the investigation might hinge on her ability to connect with Johnson and Wong as fellow soldiers. It was a delicate balance. She needed to be professional and objective, but also empathetic and understanding. The skills she had learned during the Williams investigation would be put to the test once again. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at the photo of her father that sat on her nightstand. She wondered what advice he would give her about navigating these complex ethical waters. Probably something about always doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost or political implications. Tomorrow would be the beginning of her first real test as a military police investigator. The stakes were high, the situation was complicated, and there were no easy answers. But Sarah felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had proven herself capable of standing up to corruption before, and she was prepared to do it again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg parade grounds as Sarah Martinez made her way to the 82nd Airborne Division headquarters. 3 weeks had passed since she began investigating the allegations against Staff Sergeant Torres, and the case had proven more complex than anyone had anticipated. Her initial conversations with Private First Class Johnson and Specialist Wong had been carefully orchestrated in formal meetings. Sarah had approached them under the guise of discussing military police career opportunities, hoping to build rapport before addressing the more sensitive aspects of their allegations. What she discovered challenged every assumption she had made about the case. Private First Class Johnson was a poised, articulate young woman who spoke passionately about her desire to serve her country with honor. During their first conversation at the post exchange, Johnson had been professional but guarded, answering Sarah's questions about her experiences in the 82nd Airborne without revealing anything particularly illuminating. "The unit's been good to me," Johnson had said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Staff Sergeant Torres is a solid NCO. He looks out for his soldiers and makes sure we're trained and ready." Sarah had probed gently, asking about the challenges of being a female soldier in a predominantly male infantry unit. Johnson's responses had been measured and careful, neither confirming nor denying any inappropriate behavior. Specialist Wong had been even more reserved during their meeting at the base library. She was clearly intelligent and well-educated, but there was something guarded in her manner that suggested she was carrying a burden she wasn't ready to share. "I've heard you might be interested in military police work," Sarah had said, opening the conversation casually. Wong had nodded politely. "I've considered it. Law enforcement has always interested me, but I'm not sure if it's the right fit." Their conversation had touched on the challenges of military service, the importance of trust within units, and the difficulties that could arise when that trust was violated. Wong had listened intently but offered little in return, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. It was during her third week on the case that Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. "Private Martinez? This is Specialist Wong. Could we meet somewhere private? I need to talk to you about something important." Sarah's heart rate quickened. "Of course.
When and where would be good for you?
Tonight, after duty hours. There's a quiet spot by the lake on the north side of the base.
Do you know where that is?
Sarah confirmed the location and agreed to meet at 1900 hours. As she hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Wang's request suggested that she was finally ready to share information that could be crucial to the investigation.
That evening, Sarah arrived at the designated meeting spot 10 minutes early. The lake was indeed isolated, surrounded by pine trees and far from any buildings or roads.
It was the kind of place where someone could speak freely without fear of being overheard. Wang appeared precisely on time, walking down the path with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had made a difficult decision. She was still in her duty uniform, but her normally perfect appearance showed signs of stress. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes.
"Thank you for coming," Wang said, sitting down on a bench overlooking the water.
"I'm sorry for being so mysterious, but I needed to be sure we could talk without anyone else around." Sarah joined her on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance.
"Take your time. Whatever you want to share, I'm here to listen."
Wang was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening water. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The allegations against Staff Sergeant Torres, they're not what everyone thinks they are." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm and receptive.
"What do you mean? Rebecca and we weren't victims. We were willing participants in relationships that shouldn't have happened.
But we weren't coerced or threatened or manipulated. We made our own choices, even though we knew they were wrong." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession that Wang had been carrying for months. Sarah could see the relief in her posture now that the truth was finally emerging.
"Can you help me understand how these relationships developed?" Sarah asked gently. Wang took a deep breath before continuing. "Torres is a good NCO. Really good.
He cares about his soldiers in a way that's rare in the infantry. When I was struggling with some personal issues, financial problems, family drama back home, he went out of his way to help me. Not in any official capacity, just as someone who noticed I was having a hard time."
Sarah nodded, encouraging Wang to continue without interrupting the flow of her narrative.
"It started with conversations. He'd check on me after particularly difficult training exercises, make sure I was eating properly, things like that. I was grateful for the attention, and I guess I misinterpreted his concern as something more personal." Wang paused again, clearly struggling with the emotional weight of her confession.
"I was the one who initiated physical contact. After a unit party about 4 months ago, I kissed him. He tried to stop it, said it was wrong and could ruin both our careers, but I persisted. I convinced him that we could keep it secret, that no one would ever know."
Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach.
If Wang's account was accurate, the case was far more complicated than a simple abuse of authority situation. What about Private First Class Johnson? How did she become involved? Wang's expression darkened. "Rebecca found out about Torres and me about 6 weeks after our relationship began. She confronted me privately, said she was going to report it unless I ended things immediately.
But then, she said she understood why I was attracted to him. She said she had feelings for him too." The picture that was emerging painted a very different scenario than the one Sarah had been investigating. Instead of a predatory NCO exploiting junior soldiers, it appeared that 2 young women had initiated inappropriate relationships with their squad leader.
So Rebecca also became involved with Staff Sergeant Torres?
"Not exactly," Wang replied. "She tried to, but Torres was already feeling guilty about what had happened with me. He had ended our relationship and was trying to maintain proper professional boundaries with everyone in the squad. But Rebecca was persistent, and she eventually convinced him to have dinner with her off-post." Wang stood up and walked to the edge of the water, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature.
Nothing serious happened between them. They had dinner, talked for a few hours, and that was it.
Torres told her the same thing he had told me, that any personal relationship would be inappropriate and could destroy both their careers. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to understand how the situation had evolved from these relatively minor violations into formal misconduct allegations.
If nothing serious happened, why were allegations filed?
Wong turned back to face Sarah, and, for the first time that evening, there was anger in her expression.
Because Rebecca didn't take rejection well.
When Torres maintained his professional distance after their dinner, she became convinced that it was because of his ongoing relationship with me. She didn't know that he had already ended things with me weeks earlier.
The complexity of the personal dynamics was beginning to make sense to Sarah.
3 young people had become entangled in a web of inappropriate feelings and poor decisions, with consequences that none of them had fully anticipated.
Rebecca filed the allegations?
Not directly, Wong said, returning to the bench. She confided in her roommate, Specialist Davis, about her feelings for Torres and her suspicion that he was involved with me. Davis became concerned about what she perceived as an abusive situation and reported it through the chain of command. Sarah realized that they were dealing with a situation where good intentions had created a cascade of unintended consequences. Specialist Davis had acted to protect what she believed were victims of abuse, but her intervention had triggered an investigation into relationships that were inappropriate but consensual.
Wong, why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you clarify the situation when you were first questioned?
Wong's shoulders sagged with the weight of her answer.
Because I was terrified that the truth would be even worse than the allegations. If people knew that Rebecca and I had initiated these relationships, that we had pursued a married NCO, we'd be branded as homewreckers and troublemakers. Our careers would be over, and Torres would still face discipline for failing to maintain proper boundaries. The ethical complexity of the situation was staggering. While Torres had technically violated regulations by engaging in personal relationships with subordinates, the traditional power dynamic that such regulations were designed to address had been inverted. The junior soldiers had been the initiators and aggressors, putting their squad leader in an impossible position. What do you want to happen now? Sarah asked. Wong was quiet for a long time before answering.
I want the truth to come out, even if it means facing consequences for my own actions.
Torres is a good NCO and a good man who made some poor decisions under unusual circumstances. He doesn't deserve to have his career destroyed because I couldn't handle my personal problems appropriately.
As their conversation concluded, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility for determining the appropriate course of action. The case had evolved from a potential abuse investigation into something far more nuanced, a situation where multiple parties had made poor choices, but where traditional concepts of victim and perpetrator didn't clearly apply. The next morning, Sarah briefed Agent Morrison and Sergeant First Class Chen on her conversation with Wong.
The revelation fundamentally altered their understanding of the case and raised difficult questions about how to proceed.
This changes everything, Agent Morrison said, leaning back in her chair.
If Wong's account is accurate, we're not looking at predatory behavior by an NCO.
We're looking at consensual relationships that violated regulations but didn't involve coercion or abuse of authority in the traditional sense.
Chen nodded grimly.
But we still have violations of fraternization policies, failure to maintain proper professional relationships, and potential adultery charges if Torres is married.
Sarah had been thinking about these same issues throughout the night. What about Private First Class Johnson?
We need to hear her version of events before we can draw any conclusions.
Agent Morrison agreed. You've established the best rapport with both women. Can you approach Johnson and see if she's willing to provide her own account of what happened?
Sarah spent the rest of the morning preparing for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. Johnson had been more resistant than Wong to informal discussions, and asking her to admit to inappropriate conduct would require careful handling. She found Johnson during the lunch break, eating alone in the dining facility while reviewing training manuals. Johnson looked up when Sarah approached, and her expression suggested she had been expecting this conversation.
Private First Class Johnson, could I speak with you privately for a few minutes?
Johnson closed her manual and nodded.
I figured this was coming. Wong told you the truth, didn't she? Sarah was surprised by Johnson's directness.
She shared her perspective on what happened.
I'd like to hear yours.
They moved to a quiet corner of the dining facility where they could speak without being overheard. Johnson's demeanor was resigned rather than defensive, as if she had been carrying a burden she was ready to set down. "I suppose you want to know about my relationship with Staff Sergeant Torres," Johnson said without preamble. "I want to understand what really happened, from your perspective." Johnson sighed deeply. "The truth is that I developed feelings for him that were completely inappropriate. He was professional with me at all times, but I misinterpreted his concern for his soldiers as personal interest." Her account largely corroborated Wong's version of events, but with additional details that painted an even more complex picture of the situation. "When I found out about Wong's relationship with Torres, I was jealous. I thought if she could capture his attention, maybe I could too. I pursued him aggressively, despite his clear attempts to maintain proper boundaries." Johnson described the dinner she had shared with Torres, confirming that it had been her idea and that Torres had spent most of the evening trying to explain why any personal relationship would be inappropriate. "He was a gentleman throughout the entire evening. He paid for dinner, walked me to my car, and made it clear that while he was flattered by my interest, nothing could come of it. I respected that decision, even though it was disappointing." Sarah found herself dealing with a case where the traditional roles had been completely reversed. Instead of an authority figure exploiting subordinates, she had two junior soldiers who had pursued their squad leader despite his attempts to maintain proper professional relationships. "Johnson, if that's what really happened, why didn't you clarify things when the allegations first surfaced?" Johnson's expression became pained. "Because I was embarrassed and scared. How do you explain to investigators that you pursued a married NCO without sounding desperate or immoral? I thought it would be easier to let people assume we were victims than to admit we were the aggressors." As Sarah processed Johnson's confession, she realized that the case had implications far beyond the three individuals directly involved. The situation raised questions about how the military justice system should handle cases where regulations were violated but traditional power dynamics didn't apply. That afternoon, Sarah, Agent Morrison, and Sergeant Chen met with Colonel Williams to discuss their findings and recommendations. The colonel listened intently as they outlined the complexity of the situation and the discrepancies between the original allegations and the actual circumstances. "So we have 3 soldiers who made poor personal decisions, but no evidence of coercion, abuse of authority, or predatory behavior," Colonel Williams summarized. Agent Morrison nodded. "Torres violated fraternization policies and, potentially, adultery statutes, but the circumstances suggest that he was more of a reluctant participant than an aggressive pursuer." Sergeant Chen added, "Wong and Johnson violated regulations by pursuing personal relationships with an NCO, but their actions don't constitute traditional military offenses." Colonel Williams considered their analysis for several minutes before responding. "This is exactly the kind of case that highlights the importance of thorough investigation. If we had proceeded based on the initial allegations alone, we might have destroyed the career of an NCO who was guilty of poor judgment rather than predatory behavior." Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that their investigation had uncovered the truth, even though it complicated the resolution of the case. "What happens now, sir?" "We'll recommend non-judicial punishment for Torres under Article 15, probably a reprimand and forfeiture of pay for fraternization violations. Wong and Johnson will receive counseling and additional training on appropriate professional relationships, but no formal disciplinary action." The resolution felt appropriate to Sarah, given the circumstances they had uncovered. Torres would face consequences for his actions, but they would be proportionate to his actual misconduct rather than the more serious charges that might have resulted from the original allegations. "There's one more thing," Colonel Williams added. "This case demonstrates the importance of having investigators who can look beyond surface allegations to understand the true nature of situations. Private Martinez, your work on this case has been exemplary. You've shown the kind of analytical thinking and interviewing skills that will serve you well in your investigative career." As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned from the Torres case. Military regulations existed for good reasons, but applying them required understanding the complex human dynamics that could lead to violations. Justice required not just adherence to rules, but also wisdom in understanding how those rules applied to real-world situations. 2 weeks later, the Torres case was officially closed with the recommended disciplinary actions. Torres accepted his Article 15 punishment without contesting the charges, acknowledging that his conduct had been inappropriate even if it hadn't been predatory. Wong and Johnson both expressed gratitude that the truth had finally emerged, even though it meant admitting their own poor choices. Sarah's reputation as a thorough and fair investigator began to spread throughout Fort Bragg. She had demonstrated the ability to uncover the truth in complex situations while treating all parties with respect and professionalism. It was exactly the kind of reputation that would serve her well in the challenging cases that lay ahead. But, even as one case closed, Sarah knew that her work was far from over. The military was a human institution, subject to all the complexities and failings that came with human nature. There would always be more cases to investigate, more truth to uncover, and more justice to seek. 6 months had passed since Sarah Martinez arrived at Fort Bragg, and her reputation as a skilled investigator had grown considerably throughout the installation. The Torres case had established her credibility, but it was her subsequent work on a series of increasingly complex cases that had earned her the respect of both the Criminal Investigation Division and the Military Police Corps. On a crisp October morning, Sarah sat in the CID conference room reviewing files for 3 active investigations when Agent Morrison entered with a grave expression that immediately put her on alert. "Martinez, we need to talk," Morrison said, closing the door behind her. "We've got a situation that's going to test everything you've learned." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, noting the unusual tension in Morrison's voice. In the months they had worked together, Morrison had always maintained a professional calm, even during the most challenging cases. "What's the situation?" Morrison sat down across from her and pulled out a thick classified folder marked with red tape. "This stays between us until I give you clearance to discuss it with others. We've received allegations against Colonel Marcus Thompson of the 1st Special Forces Command." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Colonel Thompson was one of the most respected officers at Fort Bragg, a decorated combat veteran with an impeccable reputation who was being considered for promotion to general officer. Allegations against someone of his stature would send shockwaves throughout the installation. "What kind of allegations?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Sexual assault," Morrison replied grimly. "The complainant is Major Jennifer Hayes, an intelligence officer assigned to Special Operations Command. She's alleging that Thompson assaulted her during an official function at the Officers Club 3 weeks ago." The name Hayes struck Sarah immediately. "Is she related to Captain Hayes from my original case?" "Her sister," Morrison confirmed. "Which adds another layer of complexity to this situation. Jennifer Hayes is a highly decorated officer with an spotless record and a reputation for integrity that matches her sister's." Sarah absorbed the implications of what Morrison was telling her. A sexual assault allegation against a colonel by a major was serious enough, but when both parties were well-respected officers with stellar reputations, the investigation would require extraordinary care and precision. "What do we know about the alleged incident?" Morrison opened the file and pulled out a timeline of events. 3 weeks ago, the 1st Special Forces Command held a formal dining event at the Officers Club to celebrate the unit's recent deployment success. Both Thompson and Hayes were in attendance, along with about 60 other officers and their spouses. Sarah studied the initial incident report, noting the careful language used to describe the allegations. "Hayes is claiming that Thompson assaulted her at this public event?" "Not during the main event," Morrison clarified. According to her statement, Thompson asked her to join him in a private office adjacent to the main dining room to discuss a classified operational matter. She agreed, believing it was a legitimate professional meeting. The scenario was already troubling to Sarah. A private meeting between a colonel and a major during a social event would be unusual under normal circumstances, and the isolated setting would provide opportunity for misconduct without witnesses. "What happened in the office?" Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "Hayes alleges that once they were alone, Thompson made inappropriate comments about her appearance and performance, then physically grabbed her and attempted to force himself on her. She managed to break free and left the office immediately." Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger she had felt during the Williams investigation. The thought of someone using their rank and authority to assault a subordinate was reprehensible, regardless of the ranks involved.
Has Hayes provided any additional details about what was said or done? Morrison nodded.
She's given a detailed written statement describing the entire encounter. Thompson allegedly told her that her career advancement would benefit from closer cooperation with senior officers. When she tried to leave, he physically restrained her and made explicit sexual demands. The pattern was disturbingly familiar to Sarah, an authority figure using position and power to coerce subordinates into sexual situations. But the high-profile nature of the case would make investigation exponentially more difficult.
What's Thompson's response to the allegations?
He's denied everything, Morrison replied. His version is that Hayes requested the private meeting to discuss concerns about her current assignment. He claims their conversation was entirely professional and lasted less than 10 minutes. He's also retained a military defense attorney, which is his right, but suggests he's taking this very seriously.
Sarah considered the challenges they would face in investigating such a case.
Unlike the Williams situation, where there had been multiple victims and a pattern of behavior, this appeared to be an isolated incident between two individuals with conflicting accounts of what happened.
Are there any witnesses to corroborate either version?
Morrison shook her head. Several people saw Thompson and Hayes leave the main dining room within a few minutes of each other, but no one witnessed their actual interaction in the office. The physical evidence is also limited: no signs of struggle in the office, no injuries to Hayes, no security cameras in that area. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Without clear physical evidence or witnesses, the case would likely come down to credibility assessments and careful analysis of circumstantial evidence.
Why am I being assigned to this case? Wouldn't CID normally handle an investigation of this magnitude independently? Morrison's expression became guarded.
General Morrison specifically requested your involvement. He believes your experience with high-profile misconduct cases and your reputation for thoroughness make you the right person to ensure this investigation is handled properly. The mention of General Morrison reminded Sarah that her work on the Williams case had attracted attention at the highest levels of Army leadership. She felt honored by the trust being placed in her, but also intimidated by the pressure to get such an important case right.
What's our timeline?
We need to move quickly but carefully, Morrison replied. Thompson is scheduled for promotion consideration next month, and Hayes has made it clear she wants this resolved before then. The longer this drags on, the more likely it is that word will leak and create a public relations nightmare for the Army.
Sarah understood the political implications of the case.
If the allegations were true, promoting Thompson to general would be a catastrophic failure of the vetting process.
If they were false, allowing unfounded accusations to destroy a decorated officer's career would be equally problematic.
What's our first step?
Morrison pulled out a detailed investigation plan.
We start by interviewing everyone who was at the officers' club that night. We need to establish a detailed timeline of events, identify anyone who might have observed Thompson and Hayes' interactions, and look for any behavior patterns that might support or contradict the allegations. Over the next several hours, Sarah and Morrison developed a comprehensive approach to the investigation. They would interview witnesses in order of their proximity to the alleged incident, starting with those who had been in the immediate vicinity of the private office and working outward to include anyone who had observed Thompson or Hayes during the evening. Their first interview was with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, the executive officer of the Special Forces Command who had organized the dining event. Kim was a sharp, professional officer who had been present throughout the entire evening and had a clear recollection of the sequence of events. Both Colonel Thompson and Major Hayes seemed to be enjoying themselves during dinner, Kim told them during the interview. Thompson gave a brief speech about the unit's recent accomplishments, and Hayes was seated at the head table as one of the distinguished guests. Sarah took careful notes as Kim described the atmosphere of the event.
Did you notice any interactions between Colonel Thompson and Major Hayes specifically?
Nothing unusual, Kim replied. Thompson spoke with several officers during the cocktail hour before dinner, including Hayes. Their conversation appeared professional and cordial from what I could observe. Morrison asked about the timing of when Thompson and Hayes had left the main dining room.
Kim consulted her own notes from the evening and provided a detailed timeline.
Thompson left the dining room at approximately 2,145 hours, about 15 minutes after the formal program concluded.
Hayes left about 5 minutes later.
I assumed they were either stepping outside for fresh air or using the facilities.
Sarah noted the timing carefully. How long were they gone?
Thompson returned to the dining room about 20 minutes later and stayed for another half hour before leaving for the evening. Hayes didn't return to the dining room at all. I assumed she had decided to leave early. The timeline was consistent with both Thompson's and Hayes' accounts of what had happened, but it didn't provide any insight into the nature of their interaction during those 20 minutes. Their next interview was with Major David Rodriguez, an intelligence officer who had been seated near Hayes during dinner and had noticed her departure from the dining room. Jennifer seemed fine during dinner, Rodriguez told them. She was engaged in conversation, laughing at appropriate moments, participating in the toasts. Nothing suggested she was uncomfortable or distressed.
Sarah probed for more details about Hayes' demeanor before and after the alleged incident. Did you notice any change in her behavior or appearance when she left the dining room? Rodriguez thought carefully before answering.
She did seem focused or purposeful when she got up from the table, but I attributed that to someone in her position being called away for official business. It wasn't unusual for intelligence officers to be summoned for urgent matters, even during social events.
Morrison asked about Hayes' relationship with other officers in the unit.
Rodriguez described her as professional, competent, and well-respected by both peers and superiors.
She's not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations, Rodriguez emphasized.
If Jennifer says something inappropriate happened, I would tend to believe her. But she's also not someone who would misinterpret normal professional interactions as something more sinister.
As the interviews continued over the next several days, a complex picture began to emerge.
Everyone who had worked with both Thompson and Hayes described them as consummate professionals who maintained appropriate boundaries and treated colleagues with respect. Neither had any history of inappropriate behavior or questionable judgment in professional relationships. Sarah found herself dealing with a case where both the accuser and the accused had impeccable reputations, making it even more challenging to determine the truth. Unlike previous cases where patterns of misconduct had eventually emerged, this appeared to be an isolated incident with no corroborating evidence beyond the parties' own accounts. The breakthrough came during their interview with Captain Lisa Chen, the officers' club manager who had been working the evening of the alleged incident. Chen had access to the club's reservation system and duty rosters, which provided detailed information about who had been in different areas of the building throughout the evening. The office where this allegedly took place is normally locked during social events, Chen explained. We only open it when senior officers need to conduct official business that can't wait.
Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Who would have access to unlock that office?
Chen checked her records. Any field-grade officer can request access, but we log all such requests for security purposes.
Let me check what we have for that evening.
After several minutes of reviewing paperwork, Chen found the information they needed. Colonel Thompson requested access to Office 12B at 2,147 hours for a classified discussion. The request was approved, and the office was unlocked for 30 minutes.
Morrison and Sarah exchanged significant glances.
The timing matched perfectly with the witness accounts of when Thompson had left the dining room, and it corroborated his claim that he had requested the meeting for official purposes.
Is there any record of Major Hayes requesting or being invited to this meeting? Sarah asked.
Chen shook her head.
The request only mentions Colonel Thompson.
It doesn't specify who else might be participating in the classified discussion. As they left the officers' club, Sarah felt both frustrated and intrigued by what they had learned. The evidence seemed to support Thompson's version that he had legitimate official business requiring a private meeting, but it didn't resolve the question of what had actually happened during that meeting.
We need to interview Hayes directly, Morrison said as they walked back to their vehicle.
So far, everything we've learned is consistent with both versions of events. The only way to get clarity is to hear Hayes' detailed account and assess her credibility. Sarah agreed, but she also felt apprehensive about the interview. Hayes was a field-grade officer with significant experience and training, not a young enlisted soldier who might be intimidated by the investigation process. If she was lying about Thompson's conduct, she would be sophisticated enough to maintain her story under questioning. If she was telling the truth, she deserved to have her allegations taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The next morning, Sarah and Morrison met with Major Jennifer Hayes in a secure conference room at the CID headquarters. Hayes arrived precisely on time, dressed in her service uniform and carrying herself with the professional bearing expected of a field-grade intelligence officer. Sarah's first impression was of someone who was composed but carrying a significant emotional burden. Hayes' posture was rigid, her responses were carefully considered, and her eyes showed signs of stress that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Major Hayes," Morrison began formally, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. As you know, we're conducting a thorough investigation of the allegations you've made against Colonel Thompson." Hayes nodded. "I understand the process, Agent Morrison. I'm prepared to provide whatever information you need to complete your investigation." Sarah studied Hayes' demeanor as Morrison began asking detailed questions about the evening of the alleged assault. Hayes' answers were precise and consistent with her written statement, delivered in the measured tone of someone accustomed to providing briefings on sensitive intelligence matters. "Can you walk us through exactly what Colonel Thompson said when he invited you to join him in the private office?" Sarah asked. Hayes' expression tightened slightly. "He approached me during the social hour after dinner and said he needed to discuss some concerns about operational security related to my current assignment. He said it was classified information that couldn't be discussed in the main dining room." The explanation sounded plausible to Sarah, exactly the kind of request that would be difficult for a major to refuse when made by a colonel. "What happened once you were in the office?" Hayes took a deep breath before continuing. "Initially, the conversation was professional. He asked about my assessment of security protocols for a classified operation. But then, his questions became more personal, asking about my living situation, whether I was seeing anyone, how I was adjusting to being assigned to Special Operations Command." Sarah noted the progression Hayes was describing. If accurate, it suggested that Thompson had used a legitimate professional pretext to create an isolated situation where he could make inappropriate advances. At what point did the conversation become overtly inappropriate? When I tried to steer the discussion back to professional matters, he told me that I was an attractive officer who could benefit from the right kind of mentorship. He said that ambitious female officers needed to understand how to work effectively with senior male officers. Morrison leaned forward slightly. "What was your response to those comments?" I told him I wasn't comfortable with the direction of the conversation and asked to return to the dining room. That's when he physically restrained me. Hayes' account of the physical assault was delivered in the same measured tone, but Sarah could see the emotional cost of recounting the incident. If Hayes was fabricating the story, she was an exceptionally skilled actress. "Can you describe exactly what Colonel Thompson did when he physically restrained you?" "He grabbed my wrist when I moved toward the door and pulled me back toward the center of the room. He then put his other hand on my shoulder and told me that I was being unnecessarily resistant and that I should relax and let things develop naturally." The specific details were troubling to Sarah, particularly the language Hayes attributed to Thompson. The phrases sounded like the kind of manipulative language that predators often use to normalize inappropriate behavior. "How did you manage to get away?" Hayes' composure finally cracked slightly. "I told him in the strongest terms to release me immediately or I would file formal charges. He seemed surprised by my reaction and let go of my wrist. I left the office immediately and went straight to my car." Morrison asked about Hayes' actions after leaving the officers' club. Hayes explained that she had spent several sleepless nights deciding whether to report the incident before finally concluding that Thompson's behavior was unacceptable regardless of his rank or reputation. "Major Hayes," Sarah said carefully, "I need to ask this directly, is there any possibility that you misinterpreted Colonel Thompson's intentions or actions? Could what you perceived as assault have been awkward but innocent professional interaction?" Hayes' expression hardened. "Private Martinez, I've been an officer in this army for 8 years. I've served in combat zones and worked with male colleagues in high-stress situations around the world. I know the difference between professional interaction and sexual assault.
What Colonel Thompson did was absolutely unambiguous.